We own two small businesses, both which have suffered greatly. But what I'm here to talk about is not what the lobbyists talk about. They do not represent me as a small business owner. I'm a social worker. I'm in private practice, and we've contracted with state and federal agencies for a long time.
I am a small business owner in Helena. I'm also a fourth-generation Montanan.
40-year roofing contractor and retired now.
Okay. First of all, I appreciate the calls for civility. As a resident of Lewis and Clark County and a business owner, we've been treated terribly uncivilly by the government since March. Been brutalized, frankly. It is, I'm sure, much easier to be civil when you haven't lost as much as I've lost since March.
Those of us who never believed that the danger of the virus justified the draconian measures put in place have lived for 10 months as slaves to those who worship safety and security over freedom and property rights. That has to end now.
Who caused this problem, this fear? It was government that caused it. Turn neighbor against neighbor. I could tell stories, but you don't have time for it. Clerks following you around, even if you want to breathe with your nose exposed, like I'm going to cough through my nose. It's ridiculous. In the first few months of COVID, understandably, we didn't know anything about it. But as we learned, what about the responsibility of the individual? That's what this country is about. We have a responsibility to ourselves and to our neighbors. If we live by those responsibilities, we can decide whether we want to go into a restaurant or not.
I have never, ever seen anyone forced at gunpoint into a store or other business by the owner. It is the private property right of a business to determine how he runs his business, and it is the choice and personal responsibility of a customer to decide which businesses they wish to patronize.
From a business side of things, what I would like to see happen and what I voted for was for more limited government and for some capitalism.
I came here to address two aspects of the bill, but after a conversation in the hall with the bill's sponsor, I now am here to oppose the bill in whole because the way it was explained to me, my understanding is that whereas with my little campground over on the west side, if this bill passes, okay, now it's assumed that if somebody comes down, ends up with COVID, says, hey, I stayed at Mountain Bike City, Conrad gave it to me, I had COVID, back in March, so I can't give it to you anymore. So I'm not going to do the Kabuki Theater mask routine. So somebody comes down, they get it, they say, Conrad gave it to me, now I'm liable. Well, then I asked them about the flu. Well, I guess I'm liable about that. I said, what if two of my campers share a meal, which a lot of my campers do. They become friends, like in hunting camp. Apparently, I'm liable for that too. So I do believe I need protection, and other business owners like the lobbyists who represent here need protection. I absolutely pray to God we get some protection. This just isn't it.
This bill codifies 2020 for the next 10 years.
Please do not pass this bill as written. Businesses should have the right to choose not to follow pandemic guidelines. The businesses can have signs informing people to do business at their own risk. These businesses should be immune to prosecution and not have their licensing withheld because of this action.
Because businesses do need protection. But it is from government, from overreaching government, from renegade health departments that they need protection most of, and not from regular citizens, individuals like myself.
Before COVID even came around, it took me 2 years with Lewis and Clark County Health Department to get a license for 4 tent spots. It was ridiculous. When COVID started, I'm like, oh my God, they're putting the Lewis and Clark County Health Department, unelected people in charge of this. And I knew it was going to be a goat rope.
So in May of 2020, my husband came home And he said to me, you might be upset with me. And I said, what? And he said, we are no longer providing electronic monitoring services to the courts and to the county. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, I was asked by the public health department to put electronic monitoring bracelets on COVID positive patients. And that bypasses my integrity. And I said to him, thank you. Thank you for respecting the rights and the integrity of the people that we serve.
And government needs to put the responsibility back on the individual and quit putting more and more laws. This thing is so political, and everybody here knows it.
Unless Lewis and Clark County Health Department has to answer to elected officials, and I know there's another bill on this, in 65, she's going to be allowed, Brenda's going to be allowed to run roughshod over us forever. Unless Lewis and Clark County Health Department is answerable to the commissioners, this bill doesn't help us. So that's what I'm going to say. Okay. And unless you've actually tangled with the county health department, you do not know the pain of which I speak.
If I wanted to design a bill that would keep killing small businesses and while protecting big hospital and big pharma, this is the one I would sponsor.
My concern is that this is going to put a blanket protection over the medical industry, which I believe is a form of corporatism. There are some things that the medical industry has been doing during the COVID pandemic that I find very concerning.
We need to consider the unintended consequences of granting immunity to those already receiving large sums of taxpayer dollars. Sections 4 and 5 violate patients' rights to due process for years to come.
A few months ago, my 95-year-old grandma fell, resulting in head trauma. This is a picture of her the next day. I'm going to submit this into evidence, please. She had more than 10 stitches. She had a broken nose and scraped up her arm. She suffers from late-stage dementia, and she requires constant supervision. When my uncle brought her to the emergency department, he was not allowed to accompany her into the waiting room. Hospital staff did not ask him any questions about her. I mean, she's 95. They didn't ask her any questions from him about her medical history or her current medications. She was left alone by the hospital staff in the waiting room for over 4 hours, during which time she forgot where she was. She was extremely frightened. She is bleeding from the head. She was unaware of her situation, and on top of that, they required her to wear a mask over her broken nose, which added to her pain. This is extremely irresponsible, and it's dangerous treatment, and it's crucial for patients that providers need to be held accountable for substandard care like this, not to be able to continue to do these types of things and not have liability for that.
My sister, who lives in Billings, has been battling an aggressive breast cancer since March of 2020. She was required to wear a mask while in the hospital to receive the much-needed chemotherapy treatments from March through August. This requirement contributed to her contracting her first ever staph infection in her nose. This can be very, very dangerous for her, as she is also a type 1 diabetic. So she does not intend to sue anyone, but giving legal immunity to those responsible for her infection incentivizes, not requires, incentivizes this substandard treatment for cancer patients and all patients in the future.
So I also have a story. I have a friend whose husband has cancer, and he's been having chemo, and of course we all know that chemo has some pretty nasty side effects to it, and so he's of course been admitted to the hospital here multiple times for multiple lengths of time. This woman has to wave goodbye to her husband at the door. Once he's in the hospital, she doesn't know what's going on. He's too weak to speak on the phone. I'm not saying the doctors don't do their best job that they can, but without an advocate in the hospital with these people, we can't expect them to get the best care that's available.
Medical malpractice happens, and to put a blanket protection over the top of them, I do not know if that's the wisest thing.
This bill rather, was designed to protect big hospital and big pharma who have huge compliance departments and really don't care about silly stuff like liberty and property rights, but does absolutely nothing for small business in small town Montana.
That Section 4 grants legal immunity to providers when altering the diagnosis or treatment of an individual in response to a federal or state statute, regulation, order, or public health guidance. That is page 5, lines 1 through 3, the part that I'm highlighting here. And first I'd like to highlight there underneath this is that last August, the CDC director, Robert Redfield, acknowledged that some hospitals had a financial incentive to overcount coronavirus deaths. In fact, that same CDC said that they acknowledged 6% of the deaths that they reported for COVID-19 is the actual accurate number for numbers of people that did die of COVID versus with it, but from other factors. The Washington Examiner also followed this up and reported that a gunshot wound victim, a motorcycle accident victim, a 77-year-old who died of Parkinson's disease were counted among COVID-19 deaths in Florida. It's just one example of many. So I would ask if anyone has audited the Montana Medical Examiner's Office or the Department of Public Health's COVID-19 records to see what do our records look like, how accurate are they. If not, then I would say that passing this legislation really is truly irresponsible as it's currently written. And why do I say that? Also, as a veteran, one of the jobs I've had after retirement is that I work in the funeral business for all military funeral honors around the state. We do about 600 to 700 funerals every year. This year alone, I've had over 50 families at least and funeral homes contact me and ask them how to correct the record because their loved one died and was coded as a COVID-19 death and they knew for a fact it had nothing to do with it. That financial incentive is pretty powerful for the hospitals here.
It is irresponsible to incentivize hospitals, medical manufacturers, etc., to prioritize COVID protocols over patients' best interest, especially when the guidelines have harmed patients. Hospitals have already been given the time, funding, and federal immunity that needed to operate during this time. The legislature first needs to investigate and review cases of substandard care, etc., before making such a sweeping decision.
Do not allow us to live in a medical dystopia for another 10 years. I would like to remind you of Benjamin Rush quote and what he warned us about during the Founding Fathers' time. He said, "A time will come when medicine will organize into an undercover dictatorship to restrict the art of healing to one man and deny equal protection and privileges to others." That time has come.
I understand as a small business owner the need for protection, but you know what? I have standards of care in my industry, and I follow them, and I follow them with integrity. I have not worn a mask in the last 10 months. I have talked with my patients about consent, and I've talked with my patients about empowerment, and I've advocated for them when they were turned away at the hospitals. And I've advocated for them as they've faced every new guidance and all the uncertainty. And I would encourage this legislation to not be driven by fear.
I mean, why don't we just get back to what America is about? Simply, just quit putting more and more regulations, withdraw the regulations, and let people be responsible for their actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.